Today I'm going to tell you about the HPCToolkit performance tools that my group has been building at Rice University. We've been building these for use on the DOE's leadership class machines, but they also run on clusters and on your laptop likely as well. They're tools that work on Linux. So first I wanted to acknowledge our current funding. We're supported by a subcontract from Argonne to provide these on the ALCF systems, also from the Department of Energy Office of Advanced Scientific Computing Research, and some supplemental funding from Intel. And so I have a collection of students over the years who have worked on this, and I've got 3 research staff, Luxano Adianto, Mike Fagan, and Mark Krentel, who are working on it at present. So today, there are a number of challenges for computational scientists. And so it's a tough time to be writing scientific applications. There's rapidly evolving platforms, and as a result, your applications need many changes as well. So on the architecture side, there's rapidly changing multi-core microprocessor designs. Also, there's an increasing architectural diversity. So we have not only multi-core processors, we have many core processors like the Intel Xeon Phi and the forthcoming Knights Landing from Intel, and then also attached accelerators like GPUs. And parallel systems are also increasing in scale. And so it used to be common that you'd work with 100 processors in a cluster in your lab. But now systems like the scale of Mira and Sequoia are just incredible with hundreds of thousands to millions of cores. And so on the application side, on these processors, there's typically less memory these days than it used to be. And so you used to have maybe 2 gigabytes a core, and that's not really the case anymore. And so applications are having to transition from MPI everywhere to use threading. And also vector parallelism is becoming increasingly important. That's important on the BlueGene-Q processor. It's also increasingly important on the Xeon Phi processor. And so you're going to need to make changes to your applications in order to target these highly multi-threaded architectures that have vector parallelism. And then finally, you're making changes to your applications themselves because you're augmenting the capabilities of your computations and adding new science to it. And so with all of these changes, trying to map them onto this highly parallel set of architectures, you need some guidance. And so tools can provide that guidance. They help you improve the scalability of your applications within and across nodes and assess weaknesses in your algorithms and your implementations. It may be that you have a reasonable algorithm, but you implemented it in such a way that it doesn't make good use of the memory hierarchy, and so it doesn't deliver good performance. And so a performance tool can help you understand where those flaws are in your algorithms and help you understand where they need attention. So some of the challenges, complex node architectures are hard to use efficiently, so there's multi-level parallelism. You have multiple cores, you have instruction-level parallelism, short vector SIMD operations, sometimes attached accelerators. All of the modern architectures have a multi-level memory hierarchy, and so in order to get good performance, you have to use your caches effectively. And as a result, there's a huge gap between what applications typically attain and the peak performance that's possible. And second, complex applications present challenges. And so they're challenging for measurement and analysis where you have highly threaded applications running on thousands or more cores. And just understanding what's going on can be a real challenge. And then third, supercomputing platforms are exceptionally challenging because they have unique hardware and microkernel-based operating systems, and your performance concerns extend beyond the processor. So not only you're interested in computation, but you're also interested in data movement and in communication and in I/O. And so without getting a complete picture of your application, it's hard to understand what needs to be done to improve its performance. And so I would argue that what users want is a multi-platform, platform-independent tool. And so you want to be able to take accurate measurements of complex parallel applications, large multilingual programs. They might be a mix of C, C++, and Fortran. You'll have heterogeneous parallelism within and across the nodes. You'll have core parallelism, and then you'll have parallelism across the multiple nodes. You have optimized code, and so almost always there's loop optimization, but in C++ you also get template instantiation, and often you get inlining of functions as well. Many times you'll have binary-only libraries that are used with your application, and so you might have a vendor's OpenMP runtime system that gets linked into your application, or a math library, and you can't ignore these things because you may be spending a lot of time in them. And so a tool needs to measure your applications with all of these pieces that are glued into it. And then there's also complex execution environments. So on clusters, you have dynamic binaries, dynamically linked binaries, where your application doesn't contain all of the code. There's sort of a separate set of shared libraries that get loaded as your application gets launched. And then on the supercomputers like Mira and the Cray systems, often you'll build statically linked binaries where all of the math libraries and the C library and whatnot will be fully linked into your application at link time, and then you'll launch them in batch jobs. And so the tools have to be able to deal with both statically linked binaries, dynamically linked binaries, and batch execution as well. And so what you want are tools for effective performance analysis. You want something that's going to pinpoint the performance problems and deliver the information to you in an insightful way. And you'd like to support analysis at the desired level. So it should be intuitive enough for application scientists like many of yourselves, and it also should be sufficient for computer scientists who are trying to analyze and tune runtime systems and the parallel programming models themselves. So we're trying to build a set of tools that will sort of span the range and allow everyone to do what they need. And our goal is to scale to the petascale and beyond. And so now I'll start to tell you a little bit about HPCToolkit and how we approach these problems. And then I'll go through a couple of the capabilities of HPCToolkit. So what HPCToolkit does is it employs binary level measurement and analysis. And so you'll observe fully optimized applications. And so often on clusters, they're going to be dynamically linked. For the supercomputers, most often you'll be statically linking all of the code together into one large executable. We'll support multilingual codes with external binary-only libraries. Now, our tools use sampling-based performance measurement. And so what this means is that we periodically interrupt the application as it's executing. And so we might use a timer, or we can also use hardware performance counters to say interrupt every thousandth of a second and say, where are you now? Or we can interrupt every 5 millionth instruction and say, where are you now? Or after a certain number of cache misses and say, where are you now? And so by choosing the sampling frequency, you have controllable overhead. So if the overhead is too high, then you can sample at a lower frequency. And the advantage of sampling is that it minimizes systematic error and avoids blind spots, because even if you're calling some binary-only library, some math library function, you're going to get samples in that as well. And so it won't be like if you just add instrumentation to your application level source code that you miss all of the rest of this stuff that's in your application. So by sampling, we get to see everything that's going on. And then finally, sampling collects a modest amount of data. And so you can collect data for large-scale parallelism, because as an execution runs, the amount of data that you have tends to be relatively constant. So unlike tracing, where the amount of data that you collect is proportional to the runtime of your execution, with sampling, if you're collecting profiles, then the profiles kind of reach a steady state and they'll not get any bigger. You'll be just increasing counts saying that I was here more often. And so our tools also allow you to collect and correlate multiple performance metrics. And so often using a single metric, like just looking at the wall clock time, is enough to tell you where you're spending your time, but it isn't enough to tell you whether you're spending your time there efficiently. And so you can use hardware performance counters to get more insight into what's going on with an application. And so diagnosing problems often involves more than one species of metric. So if I just measure, say, cache misses, well, I may know that I have a lot of cache misses in one piece of code, but if I have no idea how many loads I'm performing, then I don't know whether that reflects a large number of cache misses relative to what I'm doing in a high miss rate. And so if you're using hardware performance counters, often you're going to collect multiple different metrics and then compute some derived metrics to help you gain some insight into your code. And finally, our tools support top-down performance analysis. So they help you identify things that are of interest and then drill down to the causes by looking up and down call chains over time. So to give you an idea of what our workflow looks like, we start with your source code and you compile and link it as you normally do. And so for dynamically linked executables on Linux, there's no special attention needed. For statically linked executables, such as on BlueGeneQ, then what you do is you add this HPC link utility that we've written as a prefix to your link line. And so what HPC link does, since you're having a statically linked executable that has all of the code for your application in it, HPC link just puts the code for our profiling tool into your application as well. And so what it does is it's very lightweight instrumentation where it just catches like process and thread creation and finalization and signals. More or less, it just maintains control over your application, and then all of the rest of our measurement is through periodic sampling. So then the next step is you profile your execution, and so you launch your application binaries, and with dynamically linked executables on a cluster, you'd launch things with this HPC run script, which will then set a bunch of environment variables and then start profiling. With a statically linked executable on the BlueGeneQ systems, you use environment variables to control the monitoring. So specifically, you'll set what kinds of events you want to monitor, the periods you want to monitor, and then you run the application as normal after setting these environment variables. And then this enables you to collect statistical call path profiles of interest. So what do I mean by a call path profile? Well, when the application is running, we'll set either a timer or a hardware counter to overflow after a specific period. And then the application will get interrupted, and we'll find that we're a particular instruction. And so we might find that we're a particular machine instruction in routine C when called from B, when called from main. And so what we do is we unwind and we gather the entire call path that represents where you spent your time or incurred some cost like cache misses, and we get the full calling context where this occurred. And then over time, we'll build this tree. And so you can think of the root of the tree as being main, and then each of these interior blue nodes being one of the procedures in your application, and then the red dots being the instructions down at the leaves of the tree where we got a sample. So we're taking a series of these paths and gluing them all together and then factoring out the commonality. And so the important thing is that when you're using this kind of approach to measurement, the overhead is proportional to the sampling frequency, not the call frequency, because we don't actually trace the entry and exit of every procedure. What we do is we get interrupted, and then we look and we figure out how we got here, okay? And so the only time that we're doing that is when we've in fact received an interrupt from a hardware or trigger, from a hardware counter or a timer, and you get to control the frequency of that so you can control the overhead. So the other thing that we do that's a little bit unique for our tools is we analyze an application binary. We have a tool called HPCTruct, which recovers program structure. It analyzes machine code. It looks at the line map that the compilers recorded. It looks at whatever debugging information is present in the binary. It identifies where loop nests are. It identifies inline code, and it maps all of the transformed loops and procedures back to source. So effectively what we're doing is we're parsing the machine code, and we're looking at it to identify loops to figure out how your executable got translated to machine code. So we collect these call path profiles, which are a representation of the execution of the application. We do the binary analysis to recover program structure, and then we combine the dynamic information with the static analysis information and produce a database represents the execution of your program. So we combine multiple profiles for multiple threads, multiple processes. You can even combine multiple executions. And these tools, HPCprof and HPCprof-MPI, will correlate metrics with the static and dynamic program structure. So I mentioned there are two things here. There's HPCprof and there's HPCprof-MPI. HPCprof is a sequential program. It'll run on a head node. However, if you're analyzing hundreds of threads and processes or thousands of threads and processes, then you'll overwhelm the head node. And so, in fact, we've written an MPI program that will kind of perform a reduction over all of the performance data and then produce this database of performance results. And then finally, we have HPCViewer and HPCTraceViewer. And these are some graphical user interfaces that enable you to explore the performance data from multiple perspectives. They allow you to rank order metrics to focus on what's important, to compute some derived metrics to help gain some insight into the applications. And you can use them to look at scalability losses or waste or cycles per instruction or even memory bandwidth. And then we also have a technique that allows you to graph thread level metrics. So for a barrier, you can ask how many, for all of the threads are entering the barrier, and you want to know, is there a variation in how much time everybody spends at a particular barrier in the execution, or in barriers that occur in a particular context. Also, you can explore the evolution of behavior over time. So although we're using sampling, we also are collecting some, we can collect some trace data and show you what that looks like. So I'll have an example where I'll show you how the tools work on the trace data. So the primary interface, there are two primary interfaces for HPCToolkit. One is HPCViewer, which is a code-centric interface. And so what this shows you is there's a source pane, there's a navigation pane, and there's a metric pane. And so in the metric pane, it'll contain information such as how much time you spent in a particular context, or with hardware performance counters, it'll tell you cycle counts or counts of cache misses or whatnot, and those all appear in columns. And so the contexts are represented here in this navigation pane. And so this indentation, what this represents is a call chain. So we have main calls AMR Godunov, and then inside that is a loop, and inside that is another loop, and then we have, it calls AMR run, and so you get the idea. So there's a whole call chain here. And so not only do we have the calls, but we also have information about inline code and loops as well. So there's a couple of controls here. So there's this top-down view. So what we're seeing here right now is a top-down view. And so that's showing you main and all of the things that it called, and it's showing you how much time was spent in main and how much time was spent in AMR Godunov. And almost all of the performance goes down this particular chain. And so 90% of the time is spent down this long call chain. And so there's also a caller's view that allows you to look up call chains. And so if you have something that's being used in many different places in your application, say MPI wait, then you can look up the call chains and say, of all the time that's spent in MPI wait, it's spent in different contexts. And I want to know that 30% of the time was spent in MPI wait when called from the ocean solver, and 20% was spent from the atmosphere solver, and then the rest of it was spent from somewhere else. Then there's also a flat view that says, let me show you how much time was spent in each of the contexts without regard for, in each of the functions and the loop nests, without regard for how we got here. And then finally, there's some metric controls. And so there's one that allows you to say, well, OK, I've got 15 columns worth of data, but I just want to select down and look at one or two and sort of hide the rest. There's another one that's very powerful that allows you to compute functions. So this little f of x symbol will allow you to compute derived metrics. And so I can difference metrics, divide metrics, compute equations. And so that allows you to compute metrics that are going to give you the insight that you're looking for. So for instance, if I want to identify scalability bottlenecks, I can use that to do so. And then there's this flame button, which is very useful. So I can point it at main, and say, show me the hot path, show me what's important, and then it'll open this entire call chain. And rather than having me click the little triangles one at a time, it'll just keep opening from a parent down through a path of children. And so the rule is, when you click the flame button, if there's any child that accounts for 50% or more of the parent, then it will open that to show you what's inside it, and then continue doing that recursively. And then at any point, if the performance shatters into multiple different bins, then I can point at any one of those and click the flame button and then continue opening below that. So I mentioned that not only do we have call chains here, we also have loops, and we also have inline procedures. And so this is something that you kind of get for free. So our HPC struct utility is analyzing the application binaries. It's figuring out where inline code is. It's figuring out where the loop nests are. And then it's overlaying that over the dynamic call chain that we've recorded. So when we record this call chain where we saw main calls A calls, B calls C, and there was some sample that was taken in a particular machine instruction, what we know is the call from B to C, we know that that occurs in a particular machine instruction, and then we'll analyze the binary to find if that's inside a loop or not. And so what we're able to do is present this loop structure that's overlaid with the dynamic call chain at no runtime cost. It's just by taking the static information and the dynamic information and putting them both together. So one of the key challenges you have when using large-scale parallel systems is that as you scale to larger numbers of processors, then in fact your efficiency typically drops off. And so what you'd like is efficiency of 1.0, that as you add more and more processors, that you continue getting the full benefit of each of the processors and cores that are available. But typically what happens with applications is that the benefit tails off. And what you want to know is what's the difference here. And so the difference could be I/O, it could be that you have replicated work, and so finding out what's in that difference is often mysterious. So the goal is to have an automatic scaling analysis and to be able to pinpoint the scalability bottlenecks, guide the user to the problems, quantify the magnitude of each problem, and then diagnose the nature of the problem. And so for the top three, we really have this under control. Diagnosing the nature of the problem is something that's kind of up to you. So we can show you where the problems are, and then it's up to you to figure out exactly what the cause of the problem is. So usually if we can say that the problem is here in the source code, then you can figure out why the problem occurs. So one of the challenges for pinpointing scalability bottlenecks is that in parallel applications, modern parallel software uses many layers of libraries. And the performance is often context dependent. And so, for example, consider this skeleton for a climate code where we have the main code, and so there's a land simulation and a sea ice simulation, an ocean simulation, an atmosphere simulation, and each of these is calling MPI weight down in the bottom. And so if we measured this and found out that we're spending lots of time in MPI weight, what we need to know is what phase of the application are we waiting in. It's not good enough to just know that we're in MPI weight. And so what we need to present is the calling context that tells you that, well, MPI weight is a problem in the atmosphere code, and in fact, there's a particular place in the atmosphere code where we're spending a lot of time waiting. And so the scalability analysis can do that. And so finally, when we're monitoring, we don't have any idea what the bottleneck is. The bottleneck could be computation, it could be data movement, it could be synchronization. And so, in fact, we are monitoring in such a way that's independent of what we're actually measuring. And the constraints are that we want to only collect a modest amount of data volume, and we don't want to introduce too much perturbation in the production runs. And so by using this sampling-based performance measurement, in fact, we can have low data volume, and by controlling the sampling frequency, we can have low perturbation. So the way that you can do scalability analysis is that you have some expectations for how your parallel code is going to scale. So if you're doing strong scaling, you expect linear speed up. So ideally, if I double the number of processors, then my application is going to run twice as fast. So I'm performing the same amount of work on twice as many processors. I expect that the work that's executed is the same and that the execution time is halved. If I'm doing weak scaling, then as I double the number of processors, I'm also doubling the problem size in the aggregate so that each processor still gets the same amount of work. And so the idea is that we have these expectations as to how it's going to behave under strong scaling or how it's going to behave under weak scaling. And so you can put these expectations to work. You can measure the performance under different conditions, so different levels of parallelism or different inputs. You express these expectations as an equation, and then you compute the deviation of the expectations for each of the calling contexts in the application for both inclusive and exclusive costs. And then finally, our tool will correlate these metrics with the source code and explore the annotated call tree interactively. So in pictures, suppose I run this, I run an application and I run it on, say, 256 cores. So let's say that P is 256. And so on each of the cores, I'm going to have some calling context tree that tells me where the time was distributed in my application and how much time I spent in each of the contexts. And then if I run it on a different number of cores or processors, then I'm going to have another calling context tree that tells me sort of how my time was spent when I ran it on this larger number of processors. And so then by differencing them, then I'll end up with a tree here that represents the difference. So let's say that when I ran it on P cores, I ended up with 400K units of time in the solver. And then when I ran it on a larger number of cores, I ended up with 600K units of time in the solver. Now, if I was doing strong scaling, I have the same total amount of work to do. And so ideally, this number should be the same as this number. So it should have been the case that I had more cores that were working, but they should have each worked for a shorter time so that if we had a good parallelization, it would divide up the work and it wouldn't take any more time. And so in this case, the fact that we spent more when we went to a larger number of processors, that represents a scaling loss. And so by differencing these trees, then what we find is that we've got this 200K units of time that represents extra time in the solver. And so then dividing that through by the total amount of time in this execution gives me, so the difference gives me wasted effort. And then I can divide it through by the total execution cost for this and get the fraction of wasted effort, multiply that by 100, that gives me the percent of wasted effort. And in fact, that's the same as the percent scalability loss, okay? And so 1 minus the scalability loss is going to give me the parallel efficiency. And so if you're using weak scaling, where you're proportionally increasing the size of the problem as you increase the number of processors, then the total cost that we're going to measure across all of the P and Q processors is not constant. And so we can just multiply through by 1 over P and 1 over Q to get the scaled cost. And so the scaled cost for each of the executions on each of the cores is going to be the same. And so we can do weak scaling analysis using this as well. So I had a live demo that I was going to show you, and it turns out that in the limo as I came up, I brought up a new version of the tool which scrubbed a configuration file I had. So I'm just going to show you some slides from that for the Flash code, and I'll show you the other GUI, and I'm sure I'll have the live scalability analysis demo to show later today. So this was some work that was done with the Flash code from the University of Chicago. It's a parallel adaptive mesh refinement code. It's a block-structured AMR. It was designed to compute compressible reactive flows and solves a broad range of astrophysical problems. And so what I had collected was data on 256 cores and on 8K cores using weak scaling. And then we took those two things and we brought the measurements both up in HPCViewer. And then what we were able to do is we had the two different columns. So it shows the 256 cores, and then there's another column for the 8K cores. And then we can compute using this f of x, we can compute the scalability loss by basically just saying, I want to difference the metrics for each of these executions, and then I'll divide through by the total execution time, multiply by 100. That's going to give me the percent scalability loss. And then what this column is showing is that a significant amount of the scalability loss can be traced to this tree building phase. And so what happens is it's doing adaptive mesh refinement. And so in the course of the execution, you're going to take blocks and cut them into sub-blocks. And then each processor needs to know who has the neighboring blocks. And so what it was doing is it would take the information about its own blocks and then send it to its right neighbor. And so then the data would circulate all the way around a ring until everybody had seen the data from all the other processors. And then as the data comes by, you get data and say, is there anything in there that describes blocks that I need to know about? If not, I just pass it along. And so as all the data whiffles by, you are finding out the information about the blocks that are near you. And so the problem is that the data is going around a ring. And so when we have 256 processors, then it's going to take 256 messages to run it around a ring. If you have 8K processors, then it's going to take longer to run it around the ring. And so that's a natural scalability bottleneck. And so what we're able to do is show that 42% of the scaling loss is inside driver and it-flash. This comes from just differencing the trees. And then you click here with the flame button and say, show me where the losses are, and it opens this long path, and then it points out a loop in the code, and the loop is going from 0 to the number of processors minus 1, and then there's this send, receive, replace that represents the communication around the ring. And so the claim that I made earlier was that we can show you where the bottlenecks are, but we can't tell you why they're bottlenecks. So what this does is it shows us that we can go down in a deep call path and identify the loop nest in the program that's a problem, but we can't tell you that it has to do with this send, receive, replace, and that there's this ring that's getting longer as there's a number of processors. So it requires a little bit of art to interpret the results. And so when we showed this visualization to the Flash team, what they found was that this digital orrery communication pattern where they were sending the data all the way around a ring, that was not scalable. And so the problem was, as they were increasing the number of processors, then the cost was going up. And so what they did is they built a custom surrounding blocks construction so that instead of having to find out the information from everyone, you'd ask some processors that were in your neighborhood and that they were the ones that were likely to have your surrounding blocks. And by using this custom surrounding blocks construction, in fact, they got scalable performance. And so the time that was spent in this phase did not increase as we increased the number of processors in a weak scaling experiment. And so the difference between this, where the time is increasing as we increase the number of processors, and the time is flat as we increase the number of processors, that's the difference between scalable performance as shown in the green and non-scalable performance as shown in red. So a second thing that is sometimes useful is to understand how an application's behavior unfolds over time. And so what we're doing is we're collecting samples of your application. So we're periodically interrupting it and saying, where are you now? And we're unwinding the call chain to find out where you are. And so typically, if you're doing this in profiling where we're collecting all of this information into a tree, we're compressing out the time dimension. All we're doing is we're saying, where are you now? And then we're incrementing a count saying, I found that you were in main calls A, calls B, calls C, and you were in here 100 times. And so we've compressed out the time dimension. And so if you just look at these profiles, sometimes it can be hard to understand exactly what's going on because you end up with costs attributed in a place and you say, yes, there was a lot of cost here and I don't really understand why. And so if you want to understand temporal patterns like serialization or whatnot, these are invisible in profiles. And so what we do is we trace call path samples. And so as the execution unfolds, we interrupt the application and say, where are you now? And that gives us a chain. And so over time, we're collecting chains for each thread in the application. And so there's a set of unique chains for each thread. And then we have the processes along one dimension and time along the other dimension. And then the third dimension is the depth. So it's like the depth of the chain. And so if we pull this visibility panel all the way up to the top, we'll see that everybody was in main or things main called for the entire execution. Then we can lower the view plane and 5 minutes. Okay, we can lower the view plane and see a more detailed view of the abstraction. So let me pull up, here's the trace viewer. And so what this is showing actually is a trace of a code called AMG 2013. It's a benchmark from Lawrence Livermore. And so what we see are there are two different kinds of colors that are showing here. So these are MPI processes, and then we have the green color is showing threads. So this is the GNU OpenMP threading library. And so the way this tool works is I can point at a particular place, and it will show me the call stack of the application at that point in time. So this is 189 seconds into the execution on thread 1 of process 12. And I can move down to look at lower level views of the execution. And so what we see here is that on the main threads, it's doing something in the middle, and then it's doing something initially, and then there's this green phase, and then there's the third phase. And so I can find out what this green phase is by clicking on it, and so that says hyper PCG setup, and then over here, it's hyper PCG solve. So time is flowing from left to right, and the threads are on the vertical axis. And so now I can move down and look at a lower level of abstraction, and now I see that the OpenMP threads are doing something. And so each of the colors here is representing a procedure. And so I can click to find out what's going on here. So this is Boomer AMG build course operator. And over here is Boomer AMG, another OpenMP loop nest from build course operator. And then over here, this is GOMP barrier wait end. So this is waiting for a barrier. So all of this magenta in this figure represents waiting. And so I can kind of sum across all of the processes. Well, in this case, it seems pretty obvious. You can see that there's a fair bit of this magenta. All of this represents waiting time. And some of the processors, some of the threads are waiting a long time, and some are waiting a shorter time. So we've got some load imbalance here. And so what this view is showing is some of the load imbalance over time. I can zoom in on different parts of the execution and look a little bit deeper into the individual phases. And so, so what this is showing is, again, that we've got some load imbalance. So what you see here is kind of a mustard color. So this is relaxation as part of the adaptive mesh refinement. And so the top, the green threads are the MPI ranks, and they're doing their own thing. And then we have the OpenMP worker threads. You can see that there's some imbalance across the worker threads. And in fact, that's the same thing is true in each of the processes. Okay? And so what this gives you is an explanation for why some of the profiles are showing up the way they are. They're showing you this load imbalance over time. So this was for the Flash code as well. And so what I wanted to highlight here is that there's this section here where there's this purple region, and so it's longer on some threads than on others. And so it's waiting in an all reduce, and so the reductions show up as kind of a sharp right edge and then a ragged left edge. And the reason why it's waiting in a reduction is that on some of the threads, it's performing some of this computation that's shown in yellow, and some of the others it's not. And so for the ones not performing the yellow computation, they finish early, and so we have load imbalance. So that's the kind of information that you can get from the trace viewer. On BlueGeneQ, you can also measure and attribute the activity in the L2 cache. There's some capabilities for measuring activity in the L2 cache. And so unfortunately, it's a little bit hard to attribute back to the code because the cache is on the other side of the system. And so what we can do is have the cache trigger samples every so often. So every million cache misses, we can have it interrupt all the cores. Now, there's no direct correlation between who's causing the cache misses and what's happening in the application. But what we can say is when lots of cache misses are occurring, you interrupt all the cores, and all the cores say, I was here when bad stuff was happening. And so you don't have this direct causality relation, but what you have is suspicion that this code is responsible. And so since typically you're running SPMD codes, then everybody's running the same code. And so if you're getting lots of cache misses, you'll identify the code region that's responsible, and then you can look in a little bit more detail at your data structures. One of the other things that's difficult is analyzing applications with OpenMP. And so this is something that we've been working on for the last year or so, is to try and bridge the gap between the implementation level view of OpenMP and the user's view of OpenMP. And so we currently have a prototype of this that works on other systems, and we built a prototype that works with IBM on the BlueGeneQ system, and we have yet to resolve some licensing issues with IBM so that you can in fact use the OpenMP implementation that IBM has that has the instrumentation necessary to support this inside it. So I won't say much more about this except that it's a coming attraction, and we hope to resolve the situation over the next month or two. And so what this tools API for OpenMP does is instead of having OpenMP just shown as MPI threads and then there's the OpenMP worker threads, instead it shows you a unified view where everything maps back to this high-level application view where you can see that you have nested parallel regions, and here's where the code was called from in your application. Right now what happens is there's a worker thread off to the side, and it's executing some loops that were torn out of your application by the compiler, and it's not very intuitive. So this is showing an integrated view of OpenMP, and so instead of seeing this master worker thread dichotomy, you get to see something that looks like a full call chain, and it's summed together across all of the threads and across all of the MPI ranks in the application. And what that enables us to do is for the trace view also, we get to see something that looks kind of the same across all the threads. And so you can see that each of the threads are participating in this purple work, whereas in the previous example that I showed you, there was a clear distinction between which were the worker threads and which were the MPI threads. This kind of makes all of the threads look uniform. So one of the techniques that we use for analyzing thread performance is something called blame shifting. And so the idea is that when a thread is idle, it's often a symptom rather than a cause. And so if I'm waiting for a lock, I'm not the cause, the lock holder is the cause. And so we have a technique that we use with OpenMP to blame the idleness on the lock holder. We use another technique. If you're waiting for work, you blame the idleness on the work that's insufficiently parallel that's executing right now. And so these two techniques are part of this OMPT performance tools interface that's coming soon on BlueGeneQ. So I mentioned that it's coming soon. It's been accepted as a official TR by the OpenMP ARB, and we're working to make it part of the OpenMP standard. That's not to say that it's not going to appear before it's part of the standard. We have a prototype that works on IBM systems. We also have a prototype that we're turning over to Intel that they're going to put in their production OpenMP. And so, so some of the ongoing work is we're working to deploy the OMPT support for OpenMP on BlueGeneQ. We're looking to scale our I/O strategy. So currently we're collecting data one file per thread, and so that doesn't work so well with GPFS or Lustre when you get beyond, say, 10,000 threads. And so you can still monitor large-scale executions that are using more than 10,000 threads, but you don't monitor all the threads. In fact, you can say that I just want to monitor a fraction of the threads that are out there. So you can say I want to monitor, say, 10% or 20% of the threads in the execution. And so we're working on an I/O strategy that's going to allow you to monitor everything, but reduce the number of files so that there's less pressure on the metadata server. Also, we're working on support for scaling the hpctraceviewer by splitting it into a client and server. So instead of taking all the data and pulling it to my laptop like I showed in the demo, you could leave the data on the machine and then just have a server run on the machine and send the data to your user interface as you need it. And so we have some other work on attributing costs to data, associating costs with variables, also analysis and attribution of performance to optimize code. That's some late-breaking results that are available on Mira today for analyzing inlining well. And so some future plans, we want to do some work on resource-centric performance analysis, looking at what resources are responsible for performance losses within and across nodes, and so shared cache, network I/O links, scaling the measurement and analysis for use on the forthcoming pre-exascale systems, and then also some automated analysis to try and deliver some insights. So instead of just showing you the trace view and saying, look at it, figure out what's wrong, we'd like to be able to direct you to say, well, it seems that there's some serialization in this part of your application, and we think that that deserves some attention. So I'd be happy to answer a couple of questions. Otherwise, I can certainly take questions later in the day. I'll be around for today and tomorrow. Yes?
I was curious if there was any interest in, with more people doing scientific work in Python, if there's any interest in maybe adding support for that in the future.
So we don't specifically support applications that are written in Python themselves. However, we can do monitoring of applications that are where it's like libraries that are wrapped in Python and launched with Python. And so the difference is that with the Python, you're going to see the details of like what's happening inside the Python interpreter. We're not actually mapping it back up to the source code level. And so what I would say is that's not something that we can't do. It's just something that the DOE hasn't been interested in funding us to do to date.
So I just have to tell my boss to try to fund that.
That's right. We'd be happy to take your money. Yes?
To what extent is your strategy for having better support for OpenMP going to work well in the future? There are going to be new and different architectures, and it's taken, for example, a couple of years to have OpenMP support on BlueGene. How can we streamline that process in the future? What needs to happen?
So what I would say is that the biggest difficulty with OpenMP was trying to work with a standards committee. I don't know if you've ever served on a standards committee. We showed them a prototype of this in February 2012. And then since then, we've been grinding through a 40-page document and trying to get it approved by the OpenMP ARB, getting community buy-in. And so what I would say is that everything that we've learned for OpenMP applies equally well to other threaded programming models. So we've also worked with Silk, we've worked with pthreads, and now we're starting to work with HPX and OCR, the Open Community Runtime, which are these data flow-oriented models. And so it turns out that the same kinds of strategies that we use for monitoring OpenMP with the OMPT interface and then mapping it back to the developer's level view apply equally well for these others. So as part of the Piper project, we're looking to build kind of a unified support for multi-threaded applications.